This popped up on the radar a bit earlier. U.S. officials criticizing an encounter between a U.S. military plane and two jets from China.
The incident occurred Wednesday in the East China Sea west of North Korea. Two Chinese Su-30 aircraft intercepted an American WC-135 Constant Phoenix, an aircraft known in military parlance as a sniffer plane, a spy plane that can test for signs of a nuclear test in the atmosphere. The U.S. surveillance plane was operating in accordance with international law, according to a statement released by the Pacific Air Fleet spokesman. Quote, "While we are still investigating the incident, initial reports from the U.S. aircrew characterize the intercept as unprofessional. The issue is being addressed with China through appropriate diplomatic and military channels." Meantime, the Pentagon has deployed a second aircraft carrier strike group to the waters off the tense Korean peninsula, the first time in several years that the U.S. will have two aircraft carriers in those waters. The USS Ronald Reagan, 26,000 military personnel, and its guided missile destroyers have left a port in Japan and will join the USS Carl Vinson, according to U.S. defense officials. I'm told the DoD will not be talking about the incident with the Chinese warplanes publicly, but was told they came much too close.
The U.S. Navy is moving the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier to the Korean Peninsula. Amid heightened tensions in the region, it will conduct dual carrier training exercises with the USS Carl Vinson. This comes only days after North Korea established a substantial leap forward in their missile program. The country launched a projectile that achieved successful controlled re-entry into the Earth's lower atmosphere instead of falling back. After finishing a maintenance period and sea trials in Japan, the USS Ronald Reagan left for the Korean Peninsula Tuesday.
On Friday, North Korea's deputy UN envoy said the United States must reverse its hostile policy toward the country before talks can take place. North Korea's deputy UN ambassador Kim In-ryong said, "As everybody knows, the Americans have gestured towards dialogue, but what is important is not words, but actions." North Korea has pledged to develop a missile mounted with a nuclear warhead capable of hitting the mainland U.S. The country says the development is necessary to counter U.S. aggression.
In other news, America's top diplomat has called on North Korea to trust Washington, that it's not seeking regime change, and that a halt to the North's nuclear activities could lead to talks. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson reportedly made these comments to South Korea's special envoy to the U.S. Kwon Jang-ho has the details.
The U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has reached out to North Korea, promising no hostile intentions towards the regime. During a 40-minute meeting with Hong Seok-hyun, South Korea's special envoy on Thursday, Tillerson is reported to have called on Pyongyang to trust the U.S. According to Hong's delegation, Tillerson said they were not looking to bring about regime change or invade, and that they would respect the current system. He was also quoted as saying that the U.S. was open to engagement, but that Pyongyang would have to stop all nuclear and missile tests. Hong also later said he was impressed with Tillerson's comments on the need for pressure and sanctions, not to harass the regime, but to open up North Korea's doors for development and denuclearization. The meeting with Tillerson came a day after Hong met President Trump, who expressed hopes of engaging with Pyongyang to make peace through dialogue, but only if the conditions are right. Later, Hong met with several members of Congress, including Senator Cory Gardner, a Republican who's been vocal on North Korean affairs. Hong explained the newly elected Moon Jae-in administration's position on issues related to the North, including the deployment of the THAAD missile defense system. Hong also expressed the need for pressure and sanctions on Pyongyang, but emphasized that he agrees with Washington's calls for talks.
A rebel group in Syria, backed by the U.S. coalition, stated that an airstrike hit a convoy of Syrian and Iranian-backed militias. The militias were reportedly heading towards a base in southern Syria, where U.S. Special Forces are stationed. A rebel official added that the U.S. coalition jets struck the convoy and that the advancing Syrian and Iranian militias were about 27 kilometers from the base. Supported by the Pentagon, the group began to skirmish with the militias prior to the airstrike.
Both Syria and its ally Russia have condemned US-led airstrikes on Syrian government forces near the border with Jordan. Moscow labelled the attack unacceptable and a violation of Syrian sovereignty, while Damascus said it was a blatant attack on forces fighting terrorism. A convoy of soldiers loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was hit on Thursday as it moved nearer to US-backed rebels and a Western Special Forces unit in Tanf. Washington insists Russia was given advance notice of the latest strikes and claims warning shots were ignored. It says the convoy targeted was made up of Syrian and Iranian-backed militias. However, both Syria and Russia refute this and claim the Syrian military was attacked.
The Saudis are working to get ready for the president, complete with a well-done strip steak and some ketchup. Now, we know President Trump loves steak and ketchup. It's widely reported as his favorite meal. In his first trip to a D.C. restaurant as president, that's what he ordered. Now, President Trump is on his first foreign trip as president. His first stop is Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi caterers are getting ready for him. And that's not the only change these countries will have to get used to when the president comes. According to the AP, at the NATO and G7 summits, delegations are preparing for shorter presentations and visual aids. And the Trump team has apparently spent weeks trying to get the president some downtime each day during his time overseas.
President Donald Trump is headed to Saudi Arabia, and he's expected to announce a new arms sale that was likely made possible by his son-in-law. The New York Times reports that deal includes the purchase of an expensive THAAD defense system, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. The anti-missile system is created by U.S. company Lockheed Martin, and it appears Jared Kushner has the CEO's number. During a meeting with Saudi officials in early May, Kushner reportedly called the CEO on behalf of the Saudis to negotiate a lower price for the system. The Times reports the arms deal is worth around $110 billion over 10 years. It's meant to continue the Obama administration's protection efforts in the Persian Gulf. Lockheed is the only company that manufactures THAAD. Still, some saw Kushner's phone call as an unusual move. But the military contractor has cut the cost of its products before. In February, Lockheed slashed the price of its F-35 Lightning II fighter jets after negotiations with Trump. During his trip, the commander-in-chief is also expected to speak about terrorism and extremism and unifying allies around common goals.
Saudi Arabia's powerful Deputy Crown Prince was one of the first foreign leaders President Trump welcomed to the White House. Now he'll meet his father, King Salman, as Saudi Arabia becomes the first country to be visited by the new US president. Ties between the two nations go back to the end of the Second World War. On a US warship in the Suez Canal, President Franklin Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud did a deal that has framed the relationship between the two nations. Saudi Arabia would give the US access to its oil, which has fueled the engine that is the US economy. In return, the US provides military hardware and training. Subsequent presidents have met Abdulaziz's 6 successors, all of them his sons, but experts say the relationship has evolved.
So it's less the amount of oil that America gets, and it's more that the impact that Saudi Arabia has as a responsible player, controlling player really, because it was a dominant player in OPEC. And I think that that arrangement has withstood the test of time.
President Trump will continue to offer US military support. It's likely he'll conclude the biggest arms deal in history when he's in Riyadh. In return, he wants Saudi help on the fight against ISIL. The other big priority for the president is restarting peace efforts between the Israelis and Palestinians, and that's why the Saudis have arranged a summit of Arab and Islamic leaders while Trump is visiting. Everyone agrees that a fresh approach could be helpful in solving this long-running conflict, and President Trump certainly brings that. But Arab leaders will want to hear more than optimism. They'll want to know President Trump's plan to move things forward.
You've heard of armored vehicles for world leaders and A-list celebrities. Now, President Donald Trump is about to get an armored hotel suite. A huge security operation has been launched that aims to envelop the president and his 1,000-person entourage during his visit to Jerusalem and Bethlehem next week. Trump's accommodation during the second stop on his trip will be a bomb-proof poison gas-proof and bulletproof hotel room built to withstand the collapse of the entire building, according to Sheldon Ritz, operations manager for Jerusalem's King David Hotel.
During President Trump's first foreign trip, all eyes will be on one meeting in particular, his one-on-one with Pope Francis. Although the two have never met, they already have plenty of baggage.
A person who thinks only about building walls, wherever they may be, and not building bridges is not Christian.
For a religious leader to question a person's faith is disgraceful. I'm proud to be a Christian.
The feud was definitely eyebrow-raising in 2016, and that matters because the relationship between the American president and the Pope is really important. Believe it or not, the US and the Holy See haven't always had true diplomatic relations. The first diplomatic mission was in 1848, but a permanent ambassador didn't actually exist until 1984 under President Ronald Reagan, despite the relationship being important throughout history. For example, during World War II, FDR sent an envoy to Vatican City who, with permission from the Pope, was able to set up a key diplomatic outpost in Italy. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, Pope John XXIII wrote a pivotal statement imploring leaders to avoid a nuclear holocaust, something leader of the former Soviet Union Nikita Khrushchev called the only gleam of hope. This happened after back-channel talks between the Vatican and White House. But it was Reagan who changed the way popes and presidents interact. The two teamed up to push back against Soviet communism in the 80s, with Pope John Paul II using more persuasion in tandem with everything the United States was already doing. The alliance isn't the same as our other bilateral partnerships. A big part of it hinges on the relationship between the president and the Pope. It's all about diplomacy and influence, or soft power. And the future of that relationship depends on this trip and how much the president prioritizes diplomacy in general.
Now, the Vatican is cleaning up its books. Its Financial Information Authority says there's been a sharp drop in suspicious transactions in the city-state. In 2015, it flagged 544 deals as suspicious and blocked 1 dozen worth $2.4 million. Last year, 207 activities were marked suspicious, while 4 transactions worth $2.1 million were blocked. 57 cases have been sent to the Vatican's prosecutors since the financial watchdog was set up in 2010. The first 2 of these went on trial last year, but financial scandals involving the Vatican go back much further. It was the main shareholder in Banco Ambrosiano, which collapsed in 1982. Later that year, the bank's chairman, Roberto Calvi, was found hanged under a bridge in London.
Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has signed an executive order banning smoking in public nationwide. Government officials confirmed the signing of the order on May 18. Presidential spokesman Ernesto Abella said the ban carries a maximum penalty of 4 months jail along with a fine of 5,000 Philippine pesos. The executive order also covers vaping or the use of electronic cigarettes in public, according to Reuters. With the ban, decoration of designated smoking areas will be set up for adults and must be at least 10 meters from building entrances or exits. Philippine Health Secretary Polino Bial said the executive order was made in time for World No Tobacco Day on May 31st. The public smoking ban is similar to an ordinance that Duterte created as mayor in Davao City back in 2012.
Polls have opened in Iran's general election, with voters set to give their verdict on incumbent President Hassan Rouhani's policy of opening up to the world by cutting back on the country's nuclear program. Rouhani faces stiff opposition from hardline former prosecutor Ibrahim Raisi, who is seen by many as a favourite of the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Raisi has positioned himself as a defender of the poor and called for a much tougher line with the West. If no candidate secures a majority in this first round of voting, a runoff between the leading 2 candidates will be held in 1 week's time.
A Yale University dean is placed on leave over her scathing Yelp reviews online. One critique for a restaurant reading, quote, "If you are white trash, this is the perfect night out for you." College administrators taking action against Junju after discovering numerous posts with inappropriate language about race and class. She has apologized for those reviews.
Oregon has followed California's lead in enacting legislation to ease the process for transgender individuals to amend their birth records. According to Reuters, the measure was signed into law by Governor Kate Brown. Now, transgender Oregon residents wishing to revise their birth certificates to match their identity presentation will be able to do so by merely filling out a form, rather than having to post a public notice and petition for a court order. The state's Office of Vital Records must still develop the new forms.
CNN has reported that Chelsea Manning posted the first image of herself on Thursday since her release from military prison. Manning wrote on Instagram, "Okay, so here I am, everyone." Manning was convicted in 2013 on 20 charges, including violating the Espionage Act for leaking a massive trove of U.S. documents and video to WikiLeaks. She was found not guilty of aiding the enemy, thereby avoiding a life sentence. Out of prison, Chelsea Manning looks forward to exploring life as a woman. The day after sentencing, Manning came out as transgender. Manning began taking hormones in prison, becoming the first person to do so in military prison. She remained in an all-male Army prison until her release on Wednesday.
Breaking news now involving Julian Assange. After 7 years, Sweden is dropping an investigation into a sexual assault claim against the WikiLeaks founder. Crowd is growing outside the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where Assange has been staying now for a long time. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent Terry Moran in London with the story. Good morning, Terry.
Good morning, George. This is a moment of triumph for Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks and a key player in Donald Trump's victory last November, because WikiLeaks published those Democratic National Committee emails that played such a key role. But for nearly 5 years now, Assange has been holed up here in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, a fugitive from a rape prosecution in Sweden. And this morning, that stunning announcement, Sweden's top prosecutor saying the rape investigation is over, halted for lack of progress. But his legal troubles are not over. He could still face arrest here in London on the far less serious charge of jumping bail, and thus could be extradited to the United States on possible espionage charges. His lawyer saying this morning he's seeking asylum in France if he can get out of here.
Anti-government protesters out in force in Caracas once again, this time marching against what they say is police violence. More than 40 people have died in the month and a half since protests began. Here, stones and tear gas filled the air again. Their complaints, a lack of basic goods, endemic crime, and an increasingly authoritarian government. On Thursday, US President Donald Trump weighed in.
It is a very, very horrible problem, and from a humanitarian standpoint, it is like nothing we've seen in quite a long time.
The US Treasury announced sanctions against 8 judges in the Venezuelan Supreme Court who had accused of damaging the country's democracy. The US has tried to sanction individual Venezuelan officials before, and it hasn't really worked out that well. In the past, it's enabled the Venezuelan government to justify its oft-repeated line that the protests and the opposition in general are just part of a US-backed plot. But while those attempts by the US might be misguided, they are part of an overall increasing concern from the international community over, amongst other things, the chronic shortages in Venezuela. And And you can see that in the bridge that we're at now. People passing from Venezuela behind us to Colombia on the other side, and they're going there looking for basic foodstuffs, medicine that they just can't get at the moment back home. That's fueling general unrest. National Guard reinforcements have had to be sent in to stop looting in the western state of Táchira as Venezuela moves deeper into its drawn-out crisis.
New details about that deadly crash. It was right here in Times Square. You see our Jumbotron right there? It was right by our studio. And the driver is now facing multiple charges for running down pedestrians on the sidewalk. Police believe he was under the influence of a synthetic drug. ABC's Gio Benitez is right outside with the latest. Good morning, Gio.
George, good morning to you. Police are making it clear this was no accident. They've charged the driver with murder and attempted murder. We should tell you that this video is difficult to see.
This morning, 26-year-old Richard Rojas is behind bars after this sudden and horrific crash in the center of bustling Times Square.
I'm still very upset. I mean, I was almost killed.
In this new surveillance video, which is difficult to watch, Rojas's car can be seen making its way slowly down the street, then suddenly taking a swooping U-turn, plowing through the crowd. These images show Rojas trying to flee the scene until Ken Bradix, a bouncer at nearby Planet Hollywood, helped stop him.
But you went over there and you tackled him. You stopped him.
I stopped him.
From doing any more damage.
That's correct.
Did he say anything to you?
He was just screaming, but there were no words.
There were no words?
No words, just screaming.
More than 20 pedestrians injured, 1 killed. 18-year-old Alyssa Elsman in town visiting the city with her family from Michigan. Annie Donahue was walking right next to her right before she died.
Her purse was like a foot away from her and she was dead.
And that was the woman who you were walking right next to?
And then I decided to cross the street. And 30 seconds later, she was dead.
Police say Rojas, a Navy vet from the Bronx, drove his car down a sidewalk for more than 3 blocks from the famous 42nd Street to 45th, knocking down tourists and workers on the way before crashing into a steel barrier. Police say Rojas told them he smoked something that they believe might have been synthetic marijuana before the incident, and that he thought the world was coming to an end. They say he had many previous arrests, including 2 charges for driving under the influence. They say just last week he put a knife to a man's throat.
A lot of people right now are calling you a hero.
I don't consider myself a hero. I would just do something that I hope people would do, because I was trying to do the right thing.
A true hero right there. And now police are still investigating, but at this point, they don't believe that this was terrorism. The driver will face a judge this morning.